I'm joined on the line by Neil Sanders, and he's the author of Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, which was published at the end of last year. We spoke to you a few weeks ago, Neil, and we kind of left off halfway through. One of the things that you've looked into in your book is the way that the American intelligence services were actually using hallucinogenic drugs after World War II. So can you just remind us, what were they up to?
Well, I mean, they were using hallucinogens in a number of ways, and there was a variety of different hallucinogens that they were using. I mean, obviously, things like LSD was the main drug that they were interested in, but they were also using things like peyote extract and scopolamine and various other drugs within that particular milieu. Essentially, they were using it initially to try and break the will of prisoners of war and spies in sort of interrogation scenarios. They wanted to see if LSD combined with hypnosis and isolation and various other things could be used to tap directly into the subconscious mind and basically be used as a truth serum, or alternatively to be used to program a Manchurian candidate. And to be quite honest, LSD wasn't actually that useful in that particular arena. But what they did find a use for it, particularly people like Ewan Cameron and William Sargent, was combining it with electroshock to completely wipe people's memories, which was, that's obviously like the flip side of truth serums, wiping people's memories so that they can't actually spill the beans to your enemies or your apparent enemies.
Well, that's fascinating, because certainly the myths and legends that have come down from the 60s and 70s are that these were incredibly radical countercultural movements. Fascinating that the intelligence services would want to get involved. Why?
Well, I mean, that's the other area that they utilised hallucinogens. In what would be described as the LSD explosion or the flower power generation or the hippie movement. Essentially, they wanted to... It's kind of strange. It involved Aldous Huxley and Tavistock, and it seems to be a sort of combined Tavistock CIA social control mechanism.
Well, that's across the Atlantic, isn't it? Because Tavistock Institute is in London, and yes. Huxley was English.
Yes. So he was working basically at the behest of the Tavistock organisation over at Stanford, and there he was. It would appear that he was one of the people who was spearheading, along with an MI6 agent called Michael Hollingshead, the spread of LSD through the counterculture, through the implementation of all these so-called gurus. I mean, sort of the first person that spoke about magic mushrooms, for example, was Gordon Wasson. And Gordon Wasson was basically investigating magic mushrooms and then popularising their use at the behest of the CIA. I think it was Project 58, although I could be wrong about that. Whereas people like Timothy Leary, he was working with Frank Barron and Gordon Meyer of the CIA, and at the behest of Aldous Huxley. Michael Hollingshead, who was an MI6 agent, was also turning people on to a lot of... he was what we would call a Johnny Appleseed of acid. And then the other sort of important people were people like Alfred Hubbard, who was Captain Trips. He basically was another person that spread the concept of the transcendental nature of the drug. It just so happened that he was an OSS agent and financed by the CIA and involved in the Manhattan Project and various other very, very high-level espionage-type activities. And Owsley Stanley, along with Timothy Leary and a CIA agent named Ronald Stark, basically they ran a group that was called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and they utilised this group. They were supposedly just a ragtag bunch of about 12 hippies, and they were basically spreading different types of LSD that Owsley Stanley was making, including Monterey Purple and the very famous Orange Sunshine. But it really doesn't hold up when you look at it. Basically, there's the concept that there was just 12 kids in a Volkswagen van, because this particular type of LSD just was everywhere. It was the LSD that was used exclusively at Altamont. It was the LSD that was used exclusively by the Manson family. It was the LSD that the Rolling Stones got caught with when they got busted by David Schneiderman, who just so happened to be an FBI agent working in cahoots with the CIA. And then it was very, very popular in Vietnam as well, which, it begs the question, how on earth did these 12 kids manage to do that?
So what was the purpose of this, though? I mean, because I would imagine that, there were other movements. You talked about Leary there, but then there was Ken Kesey as well. Yeah. I mean, are we talking about almost a sort of genuine counterculture growing up around LSD, along with a kind of state-controlled counterculture, both of them vying to be the sort of the most important.
Ken Kesey, for one, basically, he got his he was turned on to acid by Michael Hollingshead, who was an MI6 agent, and a lot of the people in what was essentially called the human potential movement. It links in with the CIA's creation of cults and its investigation into the occult and various other spiritual avenues like remote viewing and that sort of thing, Scientology and various aspects of group behavior. But also, it essentially provides two uses. You create the counterculture, and it moves with the use of musicians like the Grateful Dead and stuff like that, and gurus like Timothy Leary. And very, very subtly, you can move kids away from anti-war sentiment and away from politics and actively engaging and creating change. And you can move them into the mystical, and you can move them into the arena of drugs and that sort of thing, and away from the sort of more tangible elements. And basically, they think that they're being led by heroes, and they're actually Pied Pipers. And then the second thing is it basically immediately makes a huge swathe of the population ripe for the prison industrial complex.
Well, what is that, and how does that relate to this?
Well, I mean, this came from Jolly West. Actually, he was one of the people. He was a CIA agent, and he was in Haight-Ashbury studying the hippie in his natural habitat, was what he claimed to be.
Well, this is a place in California, isn't it, where a lot of these sort of beatniks would hang out, and it was supposed to be where it was all happening.
That's supposedly the epicenter. They're in a place called Laurel Canyon, and this is where David McGowan does some excellent stuff about all the bands that moved there all at the same time that just so happened to be connected to the military-industrial complex, like Frank Zappa and Joan Baez and the Mamas and the Poppers and Jim Morrison and all these people. If you look into their background, a lot of them come from military families and such. And then, if you look at their lyrics, a lot of these artists, although on the surface they were revolutionary and anti-establishment and anti-war, that sentiment never really comes through to the fullest extent. And the artists that tended to do that tended to be dead, or not perhaps as successful as other artists. And as I say, this basically is this creation, this co-option of various groups and various genres and various new things to just direct the youth, essentially, and to criminalise them, to paint them all as hippie. I mean, this is the thing. Basically, we think of that era and we think of the concept of a hippie. Now, a lot of the people that were back there will tell you that they didn't actually like the concept of a hippie because it was simplistic, and it was not really related to them and their political aspirations and their wants and dreams for the world and stuff like that, but it was a label that was very, very comfortable to be put on by the sort of mainstream. And then you've got all these people that you can look at and go, oh, well, this is a quintessential hippie, this is a drug-using, beatnik, dirty, smelly, long-haired guy. And it's a way of grouping people together and dismissing them, essentially, and criminalising them, and unfortunately leading them on a path that's perhaps not as healthy for them as it might seem.
So fascinating that the idea of the Central Intelligence Agency with public money, sort of experimenting with these massive social experiments, watching what goes on. But I bring you back to explain how is this connected to the prison industrial complex and incarceration?
Well, I mean, essentially you can get a lot of people put in prison. A lot of people who take up this mantle of drug use, for example, LSD, which was made illegal in the mid-60s, or marijuana, which was made illegal in 1971. All of these people that associate this with counterculture movement, radicalism, all of a sudden you've got them on a criminal charge, whether that, in your opinion, is right or wrong. In the eyes of the law, all of a sudden you can criminalise these people, and anybody that's basically, I mean, somebody like Timothy Leary, a lot of his advocates and stuff like that, I mean, he was painted as a sort of champion of the youth, but he has admitted on record many times that he was financed by the CIA and the Mellon Banking Corporation, and his experiments at Harvard were under the tutelage of the CIA, and his mentor was Harry Murray, who basically was one of the first people to use LSD to try and break the will of people, in interrogation scenarios and such like that. And a lot of his supporters were, arrested, and at rallies people were, either thrown in prison, or a lot of people ended up in psychiatric wards because you push it too far, or it's mixed with bad stuff, or whatever.
But I mean, surely, hang on, because surely, I mean, there is a safety aspect to all of this, and there is a completely understandable, seeing the effects that some of these hallucinogenic drugs can have, and some of them permanent on people, that it was bound to be criminalised.
Well, absolutely. But, I mean, it doesn't stop it being utilised and spread by the agencies of the CIA, for example. You could still get acid very easily, and a lot of the people were getting it through Owsley Stanley, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and such like that, which surprisingly had CIA backing. Or then when sort of cocaine and that sort of the sort of higher end drugs come in, they're essentially in Hollywood, they were shipped around by the mafia.
So is there any evidence in the United States that any consideration for safety of those taking these drugs and using the ones that have been distributed at all?
No, not at all, not at all. It's a guinea pig farm. If you come out of it okay, that's perfectly okay. I mean, that sounds like a glib quote, but that essentially comes from an unnamed CIA agent. I forget which publication. I think it was in High Times. He did an interview, but essentially he was saying that the reason that there were so many people there and the drugs were so free at that particular time in the 60s, particularly in the Haight-Ashbury area, was the entire place was being utilised as an experiment. I mean, my personal opinion is that LSD was trying to be used in the same way that Soma is used in the Aldous Huxley book, Brave New World. It's essentially a hallucinogen that once you're on this hallucinogen, you're not bothering anybody. I mean, the other analogy is that certain drugs turn people into lotus eaters. Aside from the criminality aspect, it puts them in a state where they can't actually affect any change because they're not actually even affecting the world. And so, there's all these different aspects as to why it might be used like that. I mean, I have a sneaky suspicion that, to an extent, MDMA is being used, or is trying to be used like that at the minute.
Now, is there any actual, because you mentioned magic mushrooms there a little while ago, is there any actual difference between these kind of artificially made chemicals and the natural versions? Because you were saying that the CIA were experimenting with peyote, which is a natural hallucinogen.
And they popularised hallucinogen in magic mushrooms through a 1958 Life magazine article at the behest of Gordon Wasson, who was at the time working with the guy that discovered LSD, was working at Sandoz, whose name escapes me.
Hoffman, I think.
Albert Hoffman, thank you very much. Yeah, they were working together, basically trying to find the component that actually caused the hallucinations in things like mushrooms and peyote and salvia dianorum and various other things like that. It's a tricky one, that the sort of natural versus synthetic argument, because making natural LSD is incredibly difficult. And in the early 50s, the CIA tried to buy 10 kilograms of LSD, which, I think a single gram is about 10,000 doses. So basically, it shows you how much they wanted. And unfortunately, Sandoz, who was the only supplier of LSD at the time, said, we haven't got that. Only 40 grams have ever been made in the history of the world, because it's incredibly difficult to manufacture the LSD from the ergot mold. But then a company called Eli Lilly managed to synthetically manufacture it, to copy the components of the actual elements or the chemical, and actually make a synthetic LSD. And so since probably about 1955, I would very, very seriously doubt that any LSD has been what you would consider natural. Whether that makes a difference or not, I don't know, to be quite honest. There are some people that would tell you that, if it's natural, it's better and such like that. But I really couldn't tell you. I mean, there's some DMT is essentially, ayahuasca or whatever. They're natural, but they're incredibly potent.
Okay. Any thoughts about people listening know anyone that's had bad effects or difficulties with these drugs? I mean, obviously, it's an illegal market. Some people out there do see these things and come across them. About what you should do. I mean, it may be not something you're qualified to say, but I'll ask you anyway. What your thoughts are about any kind of help and rehabilitation when people are wrong-footed by these substances.
Well, I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I'm certainly not an expert on rehabilitation or anything like that. I mean, it's very, very difficult. You can't really sort of blanket blame the substance, for example. It's about use, abuse, or misuse, really. And, there's an argument that many of these substances are very, very useful. I mean, for example, there's many South American Indian cultures that taking ayahuasca is a rite of passage. And I know many, many people that would say that taking hallucinogens has been very beneficial to them. But it's a substance, and you have to treat it like any other substance. If you mess about with it, it'll bite you. But if you muck about too much on a bicycle and ride down a very, very steep hill with a blindfold on, abusing that substance, you're going to come a cropper. So it's a very strange and difficult thing. I mean, one of the strange things is that the only thing that you need to sort of get across is that don't in any way think that by taking drugs you are being anti-establishment. You are being establishment for two reasons. Because A, you fall into the category of doing exactly what they want, because A, you become a lotus eater, and B, you are in the market of becoming criminal, and then they have you. And B, who the hell do you think brings the drugs in anyway? Who's got the boats? Who's got the ships and the planes? And
the submarines.
Exactly. And it's provable that the CIA is the largest maneuver of illegal drugs in the entire world. But even when people say, oh, no, so I get this from the chap that goes in from this Vietnamese geezer down in the flats. Yeah, you may well do, but come on, wise up, wake up, and just basically take a tiny look at, say, Dark Alliance and the influence of the CIA on Harry O and Freeway Ricky Ross. Any drug dealer that is dealing is either not on their radar because they're not affecting enough people, or they're allowed to be on their radar. That's as simple as you can make it. Like, the police are not stupid. They can track the money. They can track your mobile phone numbers. Do you think they can't read your texts? And the amount of people who've got a Henry available, mate, and stuff like that. They know what's going on. Don't be fooled that they don't know what's going on. It's just that basically it's beneficial for certain people.
I suppose I can chip in here. I would probably say anything particularly to do with hallucinogenic drugs, if anyone is ever tempted to try these things, is make sure it's in really, really tiny, minute quantities. Because, the thing is, as you mentioned there, that particularly hallucinogenic drugs are incredibly potent. Is it a 1 gram or something has its effect? So I think, that's one thing I would definitely say.
Is thousands and thousands of it. We're talking micrograms. 25 micrograms is a threshold dose. So that's a very, very tiny amount. And don't let anyone peer pressure you into taking drugs or taking stupid amounts. And never ever do drugs around people that you don't think are cool. If they're going to annoy you or anything, get out of the way of them. It's not anything that's going to make you look better or cooler. If it's a personal thing, it will only affect you. So ignore other people and ignore peer pressure.
Well, Neil Saunders, author of Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own. I think after that little discussion they are slightly more. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back, Tony.
And I suppose I should say the obvious, really. It should be obvious anyway, which is any kind of problems like that, always do go and see your doctor.
Bristol Community FM 93.2. Your voice, your choice.